Hello everyone, this is my week 11/12 sketchbook tour. The materials I used were the graphite matte B pencils, H, 2H, 4H, and 6H, a couple of tortillions, the shop towels, a mono zero eraser, a kneaded eraser, and an X-Acto knife to sharpen my pencils. Just like my past still life projects, I found it helpful to make a value scale to initially figure out what values I should stay between for each object and shadow. As you can see, I also tried to keep track of what pencils I'm using as I go. So my process for this project started with measuring the box, then began measuring the other objects on top of it, like the can and the mask. I figured that once I got those proportions from higher up as accurate to my reference as possible, I could then move on to mapping the bottle and the ball. And lastly, after finding those measurements, it was easier to then map out these smaller objects on the bottom, like the cylinders and the triangle. After last week's still life, I decided to start from left to right to essentially avoid any smudging, which was very helpful, might I add. I as well have found it easier to start with the darker values and then moving on to the lighter values. I feel like this technique helps accentuate a simultaneous contrast relationship between the shadows and the objects and initially the background. I started with rendering the tin can behind the mask because it is the darkest value of my whole reference picture, as well as the triangle at the bottom in front of the box, which then made it easier to then focus on those other not so dark objects. I do want to add that I did spend almost an equal amount of time on first measuring all of the proportions individually as I do on rendering each object individually. This helps so that I don't have to worry about having to go back and adjust any proportions later on during the rendering process. What I feel like I struggled on the most was making sure all of those darker values weren't all the same value and didn't get lost within each other. However, I think I did a pretty good job at not losing any rendering and instead adding dimension to the mask and tin can and not getting lost within those shadows. Once I was satisfied with the rendering on that upper half of my still life, I did move on to the next darkest values, which were the triangle and block in front of the box. And then although I struggled a little on the values of the cast shadows, I think I did a pretty good job at capturing how the light source was hitting each object. My process for those lighter objects was pretty simple. I went in with mostly the H's and then blended in the direction the objects were going, like the bottle was up and down and then the circle was like this. I as well kept the values very light because the light source was the closest to these objects compared to these other objects and shapes that were further away or to an angle, like this one was to an angle. Like I mentioned before, taking my time and really measuring out the proportions before starting the rendering made me feel overall confident moving forward with the rest of the process. Overall, although we had more than enough time on this last still life, I wish I personally had more time to really bring it to life how I would have liked, through more refined detail, stronger contrast, and deeper value shifts within some of those cast shadows and objects. I'm still navigating the balance between exaggeration and staying as accurate and true to the 18/24 proportions, but I do think these past projects have helped build my confidence and pushed me forward in the rendering process with a clearer sense of form and intention. And that is my week 11/12 sketchbook tour. Thank you.